Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Story of a Storyteller. And my guest today is Joshua Gillingham. Is that right? I just realized
That's
I checked your
correct.
first name and I didn't check the surname.
That's correct. You know what? People from the UK often say Joshua Gillingham. Apparently, they say it with a J over there. But
Oh,
where my family's from in Newfoundland, they say Gillingham. Whether that's the right way to say it or not, that's how we say it in Newfoundland. So there you go. That's how it is.
I've often heard that apparently there's certain phrases and accents and stuff in Newfoundland that are very similar to parts of Ireland. So maybe it's just that we have an accent or a phraseology that's in common. I don't know.
That could
Um,
be.
yeah,
That could be. It's pretty close. I think that's the first stop when you're coming across the lake there. So yeah, yeah, totally.
that's the
I
first
just live
stop across the Atlantic.
Atlantic, right, right, yeah, yeah, yeah. Ocean, not a lake. But yeah, my family. I don't live there anymore, but my family originally, yeah, all from Newfoundland. And there's definitely a very distinctive accents, great phrases too. So I'm sure several of those were stolen or borrowed from Ireland. So yeah, yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you for
You're more than welcome.
that.
I will accept your thanks for the entire nation. It was all down to me.
Yeah.
So anyway, Joshua is the author of a series. You have a Icelandic poetry book. You have a trilogy of books that the Gateway books that will is that right? Gateway
The
books.
Gatewatch.
Gatewatch.
Yeah.
Sorry. Gatewatch, and a game designer as well, which I'm really interested in getting into the nitty gritty because one thing I really want to get into in this podcast is the different ways of storytelling, not just novels and stuff like that. So we'll talk about that in another bit. But first, could you just tell me a bit about growing up and like what school was like, and more importantly, what was the thing that you couldn't wait to get home, and what was the thing that I can't wait for school to be over so you could get home and do it or read it or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. So I always like to tell the story. I was born in Grand Prairie, which is a place in northern Alberta here in Canada, and it was very cold. In fact, the week I was born, it was minus 50, and it was like Celsius, and it was so cold that they had to keep the ambulances running like 24/7 because if they shut them off for like 10 minutes, the engine blocks would freeze and they couldn't go. So, anyways, so I was born
Wow.
in February. Yeah, yeah, in Grand Prairie, Alberta, and my mom and my dad, a younger couple, grew up there for a while. We moved around a lot. So we moved to Edmonton for a while. We moved to Vancouver, which is two kind of cities in Western Canada here. And then we moved to a small town in Alberta and then back to Edmonton. So I moved around a lot. And I think that was a big part of my growing up. I had one brother. We thankfully got along really well. A lot of the times, if you've ever moved, your siblings are kind of the only people you know for the first few weeks. And you kind of say, well, it's just you and me. So let's get along here. But yeah, but no, but I think it also made me a little bit more outgoing in terms of trying to make new friends and sort of put myself out there and yeah. But no, the thing I loved when I grew up was actually music. My parents met on a music team. They were touring across Canada, and my dad's family loved music. There was a great love of music. My mom's family, my grandpa was a school band teacher. He also was a jazz musician in Vancouver, kind of in the 50s and 60s, and continued to play sort of recreationally into his retirement, even up to a few years ago. And so, yeah, I just kind of grew up with music all around me. And especially, it's funny you mentioned the locations in Newfoundland because my favorite kind of music was Celtic music, and there's a great band. Yes, two thumbs up. There we go. There's a great band from Newfoundland called Great Big Sea, who in Canada are very popular. I don't know if they're popular over there
Haven't
in
heard of it.
Ireland as well. Okay, so I'm gonna have to send you some tracks
Yes,
afterwards. But
yeah.
yeah, it's a Great Big Sea. So they're kind of like the penultimate sort of like Newfoundland band, and they kind of represent a lot of sort of what we call East Coast maritime type music, and I really enjoyed that growing up. So I got my first guitar when I was, oh man, I must have been 11 or 12, I think. And that's basically all I did. Outside of school, I just locked myself in my room. I would play music, kind of started writing songs. And originally I was kind of more into, kind of pop punk kind of type stuff, but I eventually kind of found my way back to traditional music, the same kind of music that I loved as a kid. And yeah, and I continue to enjoy that today. That was kind of my first love, and I would say my first passion. Yeah. Yeah.
Very good. And what kind of you mentioned that you wrote stories, what or not stories, songs. What kind of themes was 11-year-old Joshua dealing with in his music?
You know what? When I was 11 years old, if I could just get two lines to rhyme, I was happy. I was like, doesn't even really make it matter if they made sense, but if they rhymed, they were like roughly the same number of syllables. I'd be like, great, all right, put that down. Those are the lyrics. But yeah, no, no. I really did see songwriting as storytelling, and my songs are typically fairly narrative focused. And I think in a lot of traditional, especially like Irish and Celtic and Scottish music, that is often the case. It's often the story, usually a sad one. My wife always laughs. She's like, "Why does all this Irish music have to be so depressing? What's wrong with this music?" And we're like, it doesn't always have to be depressing, but
Well, as an
a
Irish
lot of sad
person,
stories.
the
Yeah.
weather is
Uh,
mostly why.
there we go. Fair enough. The weather. Okay. I will actually have an answer for her next time she
Yeah.
asks me that question then. Okay, good. Good to know. So yeah, so I think I kind of borrowed from that tradition a little bit, and I love to kind of, kind of set the scene. And so one of the songs that I wrote sort of early on was called "Shall You Go Far," and it's told from the perspective of this woman who's kind of like on the shores of Ireland. She's kind of watching her love sail away, and she's kind of feeling a little bit spiteful. This is sort of like in the time of the English sort of colonizing Canada, and a lot of young men going to work there. And it was pretty common in that time too that men would come over here and they'd have kind of a wife on one side of the water, and they'd have a wife on the other side of the water, and
Okay.
families even back and forth. And there's lots of stories of conflict when their wife from Europe ends up coming over, and it was a different time, and there was many kind of issues around that. But anyway, so this woman's kind of looking out over the sea, watching her lover go, and she's kind of asking herself, like, why is it that you always get to go and I always get to stay? And are you going to remember me or not? Like, I don't really feel like I have control of this, and like I hope you return and things are the same, but maybe they won't be. And it's just yeah. So they kind of tell that story is interesting, and it's a challenge when you're writing a song because you have probably 500 words max and about 2 and 3/4 minutes. So
Yeah.
in terms of, like, you talk about short stories, that's like a short story, but you
Yeah.
do have like the music, right, and the emotion, which can kind of sort of fill in some of the colors of the story. And I think you don't have to be quite as descriptive in terms of details typically in a song, because you can sort of paint with broader strokes. But yeah,
And I
so I
think
think
you
that
have the
was.
music as well. I mean, when you're trying to tell a story through song, like the music is it like obviously that's one of the most interesting things about music is music combined with lyrics. I mean, like a sentence can change its meaning completely based on the music that's playing behind it.
Oh, totally, totally. And I don't understand how like different note combinations can make us like feel different emotions. Like that's just weird. Like that, like
Yeah.
air vibrations can make us feel like sad or make us feel happy and excited. That it's just it's there's a little bit of magic I think left in music, where a lot of the rest of life right now is sort of, we've scienced the hell out of it, and we kind of quote unquote understand it, even though we don't. But music still has that sort of magic to it, and I do appreciate that. So.
Very good. So, were there any stories or any? I mean, you mentioned how much music, kind of in Celtic music, kind of inspired you and stuff. But was there any stories or storytelling styles that really drew you in as a kid or had an influence on you?
Oh yeah, for sure. I was a kid with a big imagination. There's this great home video we have of me. I'm sort of like telling my brother this story. I'm must have been like 6 years old. He's probably 4, and he's sitting on this chair, and he's sort of patiently just like sitting there and like nodding at him, going on and on and on. And he kind of gets up to leave, and I'm like, oh no, but wait, there's more. And so, anyways, some things change, some things. Yeah. But my grandparents lived on this amazing property in British Columbia, and I don't know if you've ever had a chance to live in British Columbia. I actually live in British Columbia now,
Oh,
but the west coast of North America is really famous for its coastal rainforests. And so
yeah.
we've got these like towering like cedars and Douglas firs that are just like bigger than, yeah, they're giants, they're enormous. It kind of feels like you're living in a fantasy world, honestly. And so I got to spend summers out there at their place, and really enjoyed that. And I had this whole sort of, at one point I drew a map of it, but I had this whole sort of kingdom laid out. Like the north end of their property was like where the barbarians were, and then like in the south end of the property there was this whole forest full of like fairies and elves and stuff. And so anyways, I was always sort of imagining things like that. And as I got older, I guess that just got a little bit more polished and refined. Of course, I loved adventure series and fantasy series. I'm big into Star Wars. I think earlier on, I was kind of more into sci-fi. As I grew up, I got, a little bit more mature, maybe, and patient to be able to read things like Lord of the Rings and stuff like that, and to enjoy that. And of course, Tolkien's obviously, everybody says Tolkien, but
Yeah.
I've got more. I got more to say about Tolkien later. But yeah, he was a big influence, obviously, C.S. Lewis. And I wasn't a big reader as a kid, to be honest.
Oh,
I tried, and I kind of fell out for a few years. I was kind of in my head, I was kind of into music and stuff like that, and I wasn't reading. But I did come back to that sort of late high school, early university. I really got back into things. And in fact, one of the uh, inciting events that got me back into it was there was a Tolkien club at the university I
ah,
was at, called the Last Alliance. And I can still remember the I showed up the first day and I thought, oh, I know Tolkien. I like Tolkien. This is going to be kind of cool. I'll meet some folks. It was my first day at the university, so I'll meet some folks maybe that are like-minded. And it was in an old hall, kind of like almost like Oxford style. We try to do that with universities over here, like, oh, we want to look like Oxford. So,
Very fitting for
anyways,
a
whatever.
Tolkien club.
Very fitting for a Tolkien club. And the president, she was a second or third year, I think. She jumped up on one of the tables with a coffee cup and she started reciting the entire, Bilbo party scene, like word for word. And the audience started like responding the exact right response. And I thought, wow, I found my people. Hallelujah. Okay. So yeah. And that was a big influence in terms of trying to get me back into reading and writing. So yeah, I think it's a pretty clear line in the fantasy genre there, just of kind of exploring my grandparents' property to reading some, other fantasy works to kind of being involved in that group there.
You triggered a childhood memory of mine just there when you talked about your parents' property, your grandparents' property, in all the different areas. So
Yeah.
we being my brother and I have the one brother, we grew up on a farm,
Mm.
and whenever we had cousins come over, we would play. Anybody Irish will know the film The War of the Buttons.
War of the
Um,
Buttons. Okay. Okay.
yes, and so we made up this game inspired by that, where there was like three territories, and we'd split into three teams, and each team then had like it was like a three-way capture the flag essentially,
Okay.
but
Okay.
combined with um, beating each other up.
I love it. I love it. That's great. That's great.
But I remember like climbing down the wall at the back of the house and then like crawling under bushes to like sneak in to steal this. So, like it was just ridiculous.
Oh, it's great. And you totally get into it, right? You kind of you lose yourself in that world. Now that's great. That's great. And the whole beating each other that also helps too. If you know you're gonna get pummeled by the other guy, if you get caught, that helps you to be a little bit more, sneaky. So yeah,
It also helped that I was one of the older cousins playing, so that
that helps too. That helps too. Yeah.
Um, can you remember the first? I mean, my question originally was, can you remember the first story you wrote? But can you remember the first song you wrote as well?
Oh man, I can't remember the first song I wrote. Um, to be honest, there was a lot of like, it's a tricky question because when you write a song, I kind of think of a song as something that's like completed, and there was a lot of sort of
Yeah,
like half starts and
jingles and
verses
stuff.
and chorus. Yeah, exactly. And I had a little I bought from like a value. Do you guys have Value Village over there? Just kind of like a used clothes, used sort of thrift shop
We
kind of
have
thing.
something similar, yeah.
Yeah, so I found an old like a 8 track sort of like tape recorder at one of those when I was like 12 or something, and so I just had like tapes and tapes and tapes of these things. But yeah, the very first song that I wrote all the way through, um, honestly, I think it was probably my parents were very involved in leading the music at church, so it was probably a church song that I'd kind of like scribbled lyrics to or written, and that was probably the very first one. But that's going way back. That's probably, oh man, probably 12 or 13. Would I want to remember my first song? Would I want to hear it again? Probably
No,
not.
probably
But
not.
it was there. It was there. It's a start, right? So yeah.
I mean, you can't have a good song without getting all the bad songs out of your system, right?
Somebody famous said that one time, and I'm gonna go with
Me.
that. Yeah,
I said
sure.
it. I'm the
Let's.
famous
You
person.
said that was
Yeah,
you,
yeah.
right? Of course, of course. Yeah.
What about the first story then? Or I suppose maybe not first story. First piece of narrative fiction then.
Yeah, yeah. So I was big into probably kind of started in poetry just because that's a kind of first step in terms of
Yeah, it's very
songwriting. The
close.
lyrics are all very kind of poetic. So yeah, I would write things for school and stuff like that. I know in grade 8 one time I wrote we had to write a ballad, and I kind of thought it was a bit of a ridiculous assignment. I'm like, oh, a ballad, come on, like I just want to write, sort of like emo rock songs here. I don't want to write a ballad. But then I said, you know what? I'm going to do it. I can rhyme. I've written songs. I can do this. And I kind of just went for it, and I really enjoyed it. And I kind of made this funny story about this. It was something like a fairy that like fell out of the moon, and then she like had to kind of find her way back up to the moon somehow. And I remember my English teacher just pulling me aside, and she was like, because we'd hand in her assignments. I thought, whatever. I wrote a little more than I probably planned to, but whatever. That's great. And she pulled me aside and said, like, Joshua, you like this is really good. Like you should like it's got like the lyrical sort of like beats and some of the imagery. Like you I think you really have a gift for writing. And I kind of was taken aback a little bit at first. I thought like really like I just want to be a rock star. I don't want to write poetry. But anyways, so that was my 13-year-old self. But anyways, I think early on there was some definitely some encouragement. Pretty lucky to grow up in a family too that was very encouraging of the arts and being expressive and being creative. I mean, like both sides. Like my mom's side more with the music, and my dad's side a little bit with the music, but also with like I had uncles who were painters and uncles who were writers and uncles who, I don't know where it is in Ireland that kind of the artists go, but I had that uncle that went to Vancouver and was an artist, and he was always, for me, he was just like, he was also my godfather. So he was just, I was kind of this glorified figure of like the epitome of like, oh man, he lived his dream. He went to Vancouver and he's an artist now. And so, yeah, so there was always that kind of for me in my life. And so I think some of those early encouragements kind of spurred me on. It kind of gave me a little bit of grounding later on when I kind of decided to go for it for real. So.
Very good. And then I suppose speaking of it for real, I mean, you have your novels, you have the Icelandic poetry, and then you have All Thingy, the game, all of which have a very obvious common theme,
I
which
wonder what
is
that could
Norse
be.
mythology and kind of Viking and kind of Scandinavian, all that kind of thing. So before we get into the writing, like where did your I don't want to insult you by saying your interest. Where did your passion come from in that topic?
That's a great question. I ask the same question myself sometimes. But so yeah,
No.
no, it's weird. It's like this thing that like, and I talk to other people who are like really into all mythologies, like Norse mythology or Greek mythology, and it just like it gets under your skin. It kind of gets in your system, and you kind of just like you can't. I don't know. It's something about these stories. I think Neil Gaiman said at one point in time that myths are so fascinating because they're stories about things that never happened in the way things always were. And I'm like, oh, that's just like, yeah, that's it, right? You kind
Yeah.
of something resonates with you so deeply with these sorts of things. So it was actually at university while I was doing my teacher training, that kind of second degree, while I was skipping classes to be a part of this Last Alliance club because it lined up with one of my math classes. I passed still; it was fine. But I discovered they have a library there. They call it the Harry Potter Library because it's kind of got that Harry Potter sort of feel. There's lots of weird staircases and things that end in strange places, and these kind of old style bookshelves and just endless floors of like nobody ever seems to visit. And so I was intrigued that Tolkien was a professor. I mean, people think of him as an author, and he was an author for sure. He wrote books, but he worked as a professor, and he worked specifically in ancient languages. He did translations. He taught courses. In fact, he was famous for when he was teaching Beowulf, he had a suit of armor, as you know, any history nerd would, and he would hide in the closet the very first day, fully dressed in this suit of armor, and he'd kind of just like peek through the crack and like watch the students coming in, and he would kind of wait. He'd give himself a good like 3 or 4 minutes, so the students are kind of like, "Where's this Professor Tolkien guy? Like he's late, come on!" And right when they weren't expecting, he would burst out of the closet and start reciting the first lines of Beowulf, and he'd kind of do the whole first stanza in full armor. So I'd hear stories like this, and I thought, man, this is so cool. And so I started looking back at translations of stories like Beowulf, which is kind of a classic text that led me to the Norse myths. So there's that's fairly closely related. And if you read the Norse myths, you realize Tolkien is just like, it's a kid in a candy shop, right? Just like in terms of like themes and elements and even names, things like Gandalf and all the names of the dwarves are like literally plucked right out of Norse mythology. So that was a cool connection. And the more I read, just the more I wanted to find. There was one bookshelf. It was on like the fourth or fifth floor, and it was like way at the back, and it was super dusty. Didn't look like anybody went there. And I cleaned off every book in that shelf, and I came across not only the Norse myths but also the Icelandic sagas, which are a really interesting body of work that talk about they're kind of semi mythical accounts. Some of them are more genealogical, some of them are more narrative, but they're about the Icelanders who or the Vikings who inhabited Iceland. And I think all that connection was spurred by this kind of sense of kind of trying to figure out who I was.
Mm.
My dad's side of the family is all from Norway and Sweden, and so once again in Grand Prairie, lots of sort of Scandinavian farming communities up there from people who came over. To farm. And so I was looking back there. I took a Norwegian course even at some point in time too to start to explore the language, which was kind of started me down the path of this Icelandic stuff as well. And yeah, it was just I can't explain it. It was just the time of my life I was trying to figure myself out, and this was kind of a cool way to connect a little bit with my own sort of like heritage, but also sort of explore this new world of like who are these characters and what are these
Yeah,
stories. So yeah.
it's very, very interesting. I was definitely one of those kids that I was obsessed with knowing all the gods of all the different ancient societies, and like, well, everyone says Heracles, but it's everyone says Hercules, but it's actually Heracles, and
It's actually Heracles, right? Yeah, exactly.
all sorts of things like that. So I am totally with you.
You know that feeling. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, and it's interesting because I think there's been a bit of a resurgence in particular Norse mythology of late. I mean, you have like if we look at kind of you mentioned Neil Gaiman there, and he released a total retelling of kind of, I don't want to say all of Norse mythology, but he kind of put it all as a novel, as one book going all the way through, which did really well. You have then video games as well. I mean, we're recording this in late November 2020, and the game Assassin's Creed Valhalla just came out, and then
Yep.
last year or the year before there was the new God of War game, which was all like I'm not even going to say influenced by Norse mythology. It just is Norse mythology.
It just is straight
It
up.
just
Yeah,
is.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so what at what point did you start then thinking about creating something in that sphere of influence? Like when did you start thinking of writing stories inspired by Norse mythology?
You know what? It wasn't a really sort of premeditated process. Like I literally just devoured every single book I could get my hand on in terms of Icelandic sagas, Norse myths, translations. And all these stories are so old and have been looked at so many different times. There's multiple translations, all of them taking different approaches. So the earlier, more academic ones that I had were very literal translations,
Mm.
which has its place. It's great in terms of sort of getting to know the narrative. You have to fight through it a little bit more to understand what's going on. But later on, I was able to read some more kind of interpreted works. One of my favorite translations of the Norse myths is by Dr. Kevin Crossley Holland, and he does a really nice balance, I think, of sort of the academic side and also sort of the narrative side in terms of trying to help you figure out what's going on. And Neil Gaiman does a great job too. You can tell he spent a lot of times with the myths when he tells his stories, because in the myths, it's famous for they'll and Vikings did this too. This is in their poetry as well. This is a very cultural thing. They'll just sort of like make these like offhanded references to things that they'll assume or that they're almost like little ways of like showing off the like look at my prowess. I know so much about the myths. I'm just going to randomly mention this here, and that connects to this other story, which, if you're familiar with the whole body of work, is
Mm.
here, and that's really frustrating for new readers. So that made it a little bit difficult to approach. Yeah, no. In terms of the myths themselves, though, and writing my story, I literally felt like my head was so packed full of these characters and these narratives and these stories that they just had to come out. And so I didn't really sit down one day and say, "Oh, I would really like to write a book about Norse mythology." I kind of literally felt like my brain was going to explode. I had these ideas that were swirling around, and I actually originally wrote my book to be exactly kind of what you described God of War as, is just a retelling of one of my favorite stories from Norse mythology. And as things do, you're a writer, you know this, so they kind of grew legs, and it kind of a soul of its own and took its own direction. But anybody who reads the book, if you're familiar with Norse mythology, you're going to see a lot of the references being made for the characters. For example, the three main characters, Thorin, Brin, and Grimstad, they're these troll hunters who are headed on this adventure. They're inspired by Odin, Thor, and Loki, and so they're kind of their personalities align quite closely with those three characters. And a lot of the themes, a lot of the events are sort of back references, but overall it ended up being a kind of a brand new world, which was exciting for me to explore too, because I'd always wanted to write something in that vein, and I'd never really had the I think the artistic discipline to kind of sit down and do something
Mm.
that big. And so it was really cool. I kind of had this knowledge, this sort of inspiration, the seed for this world. And I had, I was a little bit older now. I was a little bit more patient, a little bit more focused, a little bit more organized. And I was able to kind of combine those two into, yeah, writing my first book.
Very good. And then, so speaking of your first book, which is The Gatewatch, I'm going to get it right this time. Um, uh, how long from when you decided to actually start writing it as your first book to it publishing? What was that journey like? Because you're traditionally published, and I have interviewed traditionally published authors on this show, but it's mostly indie. So can you tell me a little bit about that journey? I suppose.
Sure, sure. So I probably spent a good like 2.5 to 3 years in the first chapter. I would start it, I'd get all excited, I'd get 4 or 5 thousand words in, and then I'd kind of get stuck, and I'd start like, well, when I have an idea, when I feel inspired, I'll come back to it. And like literally, I'm talking like 3 or 4 years, and I probably rewrote that probably 8, 9, 12. I don't even know how many times I rewrote that chapter. I didn't get anywhere, and in fact, it's funny both. Metaphorically and literally, they were trying to get up a mountain. That's the very first
Yeah.
scene, and I just kept kind of going up the mountain and like rolling back down, going up, then rolling back down. And what really changed the game for me was a book by another author named Stephen Pressfield. I don't know if you've ever read The War of Art, but The War of Art is this incredible. It's short. It's like this thick, and it's basically his sort of philosophy of writing. And it literally, I'm not just in terms of creatively, just turned my life around. I kind of, I felt like I was stuck. It was my first 2 years of teaching. I literally at the end of every term, I almost quit the first 2 years.
Yeah.
It was just, it's tough. The first 2 years, it's so much. And I was pulling like, 70, 72 hour weeks of like, planning and assigning and assessing. And yeah, like that's, and every teacher has a story like that. That's
Yeah.
just how things work. So it was kind of right near the end of that period. I was basically ready to give up on teaching and go back. I don't know. I was going to go do anything other than teaching, just because I was so sort of like personally burnt out. And what this book helped me kind of do is find, a passion, something to fill the tank again. And now, I've continued to teach, and I really enjoy teaching. But I have that sort of thing to fill me up. So, anyways, that's a long way of saying his book was really inspiring and sort of set me straight. I'll just really briefly, his philosophy is basically that there's this thing called the resistance, and everybody's sort of like born to create something. It could be music, it could be art, it could be, it could be to, a new way of, training for athletes, like whatever. Like we're all kind of here for something, and there's like a physical force that's sort of fighting you on that. And it's very devious. It almost kind of feels a little bit like the kind of biblical devil. He doesn't call it that, but let's, whatever, the resistance, right? And so but the book is interesting in that it teaches you some like approaches to dealing with this. And as I read the book, I was just like, oh yeah, that's me. Oh, I'm procrastinating, right? And this is all kind of part of this like force that's trying to stop me from doing this. And like, oh,
Yeah.
I'm just feeling miserable kind of doing things that trying to watch TV or kind of fill that gap doing something else. And it wasn't until I really sat down seriously to do this book and to write it that A, I started making progress on it, and then B, that I actually just kind of started feeling like that part of me was being filled up, and that as a person, I'm not even talking just as a writer, but as a person, I kind of had a little bit more balance in my life, and purpose, I guess. Yeah.
Mm. I think as well, you kind of spoken it there. It seems to have brought like the balance that is something that nearly always happens to every teacher. They go out of balance because it's such a demanding job creatively and academically and emotionally and even physically sometimes. So it's something every teacher goes through. Those first 2 3 years, sometimes even they're just teaching consumes you.
Exactly. It's a thing. Yeah, it's a thing, right? Yeah, yeah, totally, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
So then what was the submission process like? So you've got to the point where you have a full book and you're really happy with it and you're ready to go. So what was it like then to find somebody to publish it?
Yeah, so I'd spent about 2 years writing the book. I was still kind of getting my writing process down, and my second book took me much less time, but it took me about 2 years to complete the book. And honestly, I didn't even know if it was going to be published. I was sort of just like, it was more of like a me project. I'm like, I'm going to write the story I want to write, and I wasn't thinking about, is this going to be marketable? Is this going to be anything? But anyways, I ended up finishing it. I was really proud that I finished it. First off, I was like, even if this never gets published, I'm so happy this happened. And I thought that to have it finished, I should try to take it all the way. I should try to publish. And to be honest, like I'm a teacher. It's not like I'm not going to eat next week if this doesn't get
Yeah.
published. So what do I have to lose? And that was, if I'm going to say anything to any like new writer, if you're already working a job that's sort of paying the bills and stuff like that, and you're trying to write, it's tough to write on top of doing a regular job. But it can be scary to submit to publishers. It can be scary to query agents and stuff like that. But really, if you're willing to put yourself out there, you don't have anything to lose. The worst thing they could say is no, and that's not going to feel great. It's going to feel pretty terrible. But if you can kind of get yourself through that and muscle through that, it's amazing kind of what opportunities can open up. And so I set up a query schedule. I did a lot of research. In fact, I just about had a little bit of a breakdown because I was looking up, I'd finished my book and I'm like, okay, I'm ready to query this. And I was basically doing that, Googling, like, how do I get published, that sort of thing. And one of the first articles I came up on was like, well, if you're a new writer, one thing you don't want to do if you want to get published is write a full novel, because if you write a full novel and it sucks, then you just wasted a year or 2 years of your life. We should start with is short stories, and once you get published and you get your name out, then you can kind of get. So I'm just sitting here being like, oh my
No.
goodness, I spent the last 2 years of my life writing this story, and maybe that wasn't the best advice. Though their point was basically, if you write short stories and they don't work out or they don't get published, you've only kind of spent a few months, and it's a good kind of way to practice finishing things.
Yeah.
So I get the point of that, but for
I
me, I was
get
in a
it,
little
but
bit of
I must say I disagree with it because I think it's a completely different discipline. I mean, that's like saying,
yes.
well, if you want to run a marathon, do a couple of 100-meter sprints. And it's like, well, yeah, that's the same. You're running, but at the same time, it's a complete. You have to move a different way. Like there's pacing. There's so much. So the same with writing. I think that again, this is just my opinion. That was their opinion, and everyone's opinion is valid. They were wrong, but their opinion's valid.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And actually, you bringing that up actually kind of highlights a really important part. I think that a lot of newer authors maybe don't understand about publishing is that publishing is not about writing,
Yeah,
right? Like publishing is about publishing is an industry, and publishing is about selling books,
yeah, it's about making
and
money.
it's about making money at the end of the day. And it's not that you need to like sell your soul and that you need to like never kind of write anything that you're passionate about ever again. But you just have to realize like when you're talking to publishers, when you're talking to agents, they're not like looking for like your heart's greatest expression of its true self. They're looking for like a book that is going to sell, right? So and you have to sort of distance yourself from that. I'm a big fan of in terms of philosophy. I was a bit of a nerd in university. I like taking that too, of stoicism, right? So it's sort of like removing yourself a little bit. And Stephen Pressfield talks about that a little bit in his book, The War of Art, is being able to kind of remove yourself from your work. You need to have yourself fully invested while you're writing it. Your passion has to flow through. If it doesn't flow through, it's not going to have that sort of spark and magic. But when you kind of take it to a publisher, you do have to kind of remove yourself from it a bit, and you're putting it out there. So I set myself up on a query schedule for agents, for publishers, and I would query 1 to 2 agents or publishers per week. And I just did that. And I said, I'm just going to keep doing this until I get published. And
Yeah.
so I did it for 4 months,
Oh
just
wow.
every Monday. I just like to sometimes if I was really on fire, I'd send off 3, always personalized, never generic. I'd like research them and what they what kind of books they published. I would look at who else, what other authors they'd published, if I'd read any of their books. I'd mention that, oh, I really enjoyed this by this person and my work has these sort of similarities. And yeah, nobody knew my name. Like I didn't really have a social platform. That's the other thing I started was engaging a bit on Twitter, because if you want to be a published author, you've got to have a bit of presence. It makes writers crazy, I think, sometimes to see sort of celebrities who have never spent a day at the keyboard suddenly just like come out with a book. And it's like how do they like what I've
They
spent
did
years
it
writing
like
this.
ghostwriters.
I know, that's right, they've got ghostwriters. But that just points to another like thing you got to understand about publishing is like publishing is a little bit about like your public image. Like people want to read
Mm,
books that are great books, but they also, there's this thing of like you kind of have to have a platform or a sort of an image or like a name that people see. So and this can be a big issue for writers. I know I've got a writer friend in Vancouver who loves his series that he's writing, but he wants to do in a different genre, and he's having a big problem right now because he's so known for this one sort of genre that
yeah.
he can't just sort of put something else out. He's gonna have to come up with a pen name or sort of a different like image, and to do that he's also gonna have to sort of start building that image up, or that sort of brand, kind of create some platforms for it. And that's a tricky thing, and it doesn't feel like writing. It feels like kind of being in like a business seminar sometimes. I don't like that about publishing, but it's an important step. And so in terms of getting published, I was making those kind of sort of connections. I was kind of building a social platform, started writing some articles for different news sources. One of them, called Becoming a Resilient Writer, was fairly popular, and it was published in the UK and in the States and in Canada and different places. And eventually, I got that call. I had kind of racking up rejections, and every time I got a rejection, I would go and kind of take myself out for a coffee, saying, "Ooh, okay, I tried." And I think it's important to celebrate rejections. That's going to sound weird. It sounds terrible, but the other time, like if you are getting rejected by a publisher, you are like 98% further down the road than most other people ever get who say they're going to write a novel, right? You finished your novel. Like, wow, that's something to celebrate in itself. And the fact that you had the guts to kind of put it out there and ask a publisher if they wanted to publish it, like, once again, the number of stories, books, beautiful, amazing books that get written and just sit on people's shelves. This is the same with board game design. The number of board games too that just get designed by folks who spend maybe years developing these things, but just are never able to kind of put them out there. It's tragic, really, and understandable. It's not easy to put yourself out there,
Yeah.
but it is that kind of critical, last, important step if that's your dream to become a published author. So that was a very long-winded answer to a very short question, but yes, that's kind of how it went. Crow's Nest Books, who's a Canadian publisher out of Toronto, enjoyed the book. They do more. They write textbooks, and they also do a lot of sort of, they call themselves like imaginative fiction. They're a great publisher to work with. I was also very excited to work with a Canadian publisher because, as a Canadian, obviously we love things from the States in terms of like culture and music and stuff like that.
Mm,
But you do sometimes feel like you're a little bit like in the shadow of a kind of a behemoth, right? So
yeah.
it was nice to work with a Canadian publisher who was interested in Canadian content. And yeah, they were great to work with. A smaller press, but I was really happy with how the book came out.
That's brilliant. And when you, just because I know that your book is part of a what will be a trilogy. So when, because and to be honest, this is more for me that I'm asking at this point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
I love it. I
I
love it.
I just wrote what I think is the first draft of what was originally going to be one book, but now I'm finished the first draft of and it's a kid's book and it's a fantasy book, and I'm struggling because now I'm looking at it thinking there's so much more I can do with this. Do I expand it out to a trilogy, or do I just try and tighten it up? That kind of thing. So when you wrote your first book, did you write it with it being a trilogy in mind? And on top of that, could you also tell me how did you then kind of pitch that to the publishing house, or were they the ones that kind of pushed you to do sequels?
Great question. So one of the reasons I realized when I was stuck on that mountain was that I was starting the story in the middle, and the story I kind of originally set out to tell ended up being the second book, and the first
Oh,
book
okay.
ended up being it was just supposed to be like a little sort of like like intro chapter sort of prologue sort of thing, and it turned into its own whole adventure. And so yeah, it was a wild ride. Let me tell you. So I finished that first book, which was supposed to be a prologue. Now it's a full book because I realized I was starting in the middle. I hadn't filled out the world. I knew the characters in my head because I've been living
Yeah.
with them for years, but I hadn't given it up to the reader. So I needed that. Not that the first book is just like an establishing shot; it's a whole narrative arc unto itself, a whole adventure. But that was important. So when I started this querying, like that 4 months of querying, followed by almost a year and a half of editing before the book actually came out. Not editing in terms of going back and doing it a lot, but just it the things take time. So to help me not lose my mind, I started writing the second book. And actually, by the time my first book came out, I was finished my second book and I'd submitted the manuscript to the publisher for the second book. And they hadn't asked for that, but I'd kind of thought in my mind, that was the story I originally set out to tell. And it's looking now like it's going to turn into a really nice trilogy. And so I'm working on the third book now, once again, so I don't lose my mind while the second book is coming out. And I definitely suggest that if you finish a story and you're querying, start something else creatively. Because querying process for me took about 4 to 5 months, which is almost like that's so fast. If it takes four to
Yeah.
five months, that's don't expect that. Probably expect like a year, maybe 2 years. You got to have something else going because I think that's another sort of trap that writers might fall into is they might write their one book that is going to be the one creative contribution they're going to
Masterpiece.
make to the world, their masterpiece, right? That's right. And they just won't move on from that. And they'll query and they'll query and they'll get rejection after rejection after rejection. And eventually they're going to feel like my masterpiece is getting rejected all over the place. My art must be worthless. So I better give up, which is so sad. And there's a little bit of hubris, I think, there too, as a writer. If you think your first book is going to be the best book you ever write, I, I I hate to tell you this, but your next book is probably going to be better. I hope it's better because writing's a craft, right? Improve. If you're a carpenter and like the first chair you make, if you're like, this is the greatest chair that has ever been known to man, I'm never going to make a greater chair than this. It's like, you know, in that context, it seems ridiculous, but a lot of people do that with their writing. And part of that is sort of that personal investment and kind of being able to remove yourself and look at it and say, this was great. There's some excellent elements here. I could improve on this. I could tighten this up. And it was amazing for the second book. First off, how much smoother it was. I kind of got my writing process down a little bit better.
Mm.
And second off, I think that the characters were a little bit richer. The dialogue was cleaner. There was, and once again, I love the first book, and I really am happy with how it turned out. And now even going to the third book, there's some novel length pacing I wouldn't say issues but sort of bumps that I think I ran into in the first two books. In the second book, given the advice of one of my writer friends in Vancouver, they said, if they like your first book, write the second book sort of like a similar sort of thing, include all the elements they love, and the third book you can kind of go hog wild for it. So in the third book, I feel like I've got those pacing things down, and it's amazing to see sort of like the steps of my own personal growth, and I hope the
Yeah.
readers can see that too in those three books. And I've just started sort of sketching out a new series, and it's amazing having a full trilogy behind me now, or almost behind me. I'm just at the end of the third book. Looking at a new series, I feel like I just have so much more a grounding in a sense of this is how long it's going to take to write. This is how I should plot things out in terms of what works for me. And so yeah, your first book is a big deal. Don't get me wrong. Like getting that written, even if you can get it published, awesome. That's great. But that's chapter one, right? So
Yeah.
there's a long journey ahead, and I encourage you, yeah, especially if you kind of feel like your book's kind of going into two or three. Publishers, I think, love if you can come to them with, I've got this like two books out
Idea.
of three
Yeah.
written or three books written. They love that kind of stuff because once again, they're they're looking to print books and sell books, and if you've got books, that's what they're looking for, right? So
Exactly.
yeah, not that I would consider myself a professional in the publishing industry. I think my path has been a little bit unique, working with a smaller publisher. No, that's I yeah, definitely encourage you to take a look at that. If it's going to be 2 or 3 books, awesome, awesome,
Yeah.
because kids read fast too. When they get into a series, they just like plug through them. So if you got multiple books lined up, awesome. Yeah.
I there's something that um Roald Dahl said, that children are kind of not the harshest critics, but like a kid, I mean, I know I did. A kid will often like literally read the last page, close it, flip the book over, and just start again on page one. Like
Yeah.
they love books much more than any adult ever could, and I think that's something writers have to bear in mind. Like this isn't going to be read once. If a kid loves it, it's going to be read multiple times.
Again and again and again. I don't know if you have those books that you read again and again and again, but I know I definitely do. And it's
Matilda for me. Roald
yeah,
Dahl,
yeah,
Roald Dahl's Matilda. I have a really clear memory of sitting on a bed in the spare room in the house, which is now my mom and dad's office, of like finishing the last page and being really sad it was over, and then going, hang on, and flipping it and going, woo, let's go again.
yeah, yeah. That was so fun the first time. Yeah, it's great. That's great. Yeah,
Now, we talked a lot about writing, but I really, really want to talk about game design
yeah,
because
yeah. Let's do it.
this is great. As we're speaking now, the All Thingy is still nearly finished its Kickstarter campaign. So first, can you explain? I don't know where to start, man. I mean, there's so much I want to ask, and I'm like, oh,
Where the
what did
heck
I
did you
talk?
start with all this stuff? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So yeah, game design was one of the. So my original university degree was in mathematics, and I loved sort of like the logic and sort of the puzzles of things. And there was always that sort of narrative, like storyteller side of me, but there's also this sort of like robot brain that I had that just like loved the numbers and logic, right? It's like some sort of cyborg. Game design is interesting. I kind of feel it's like kind of like the other half. If I had sort of like a Jekyll and Hyde, sort of the books are sort of the the written sort of narrative, and the board games are more, I'm going to call them mechanical narratives, because that's really what board games are, right? Is they're you set up
yeah,
sort of a
yeah.
mechanical system set in a certain sort of theme, and you invite players to kind of like sit at the table and kind of take part and in the narrative. And even if it's not a role-playing game, an RPG like Dungeons and Dragons, even if it's something like Settlers of Catan or Seven Wonders, depending on what kind of board games you like, you still do kind of take on a role, and you imagine yourself in a system, and you're interacting with other players as if they're characters in that world. So I really do see it as a narrative process, but one that's much more limited in terms of time. I enjoy playing games that are, every Friday night I go to before COVID here, we're shut down for a bit, but we play board games that are 3 or 4 hours long per play, kind of thing, with instructional videos that are like 45 minutes long. We're into that sort of thing. But the games I design, and that often people will start designing, are shorter, 20, 40, 60 minutes, sort of little mini adventures that people go through. There's often a kind of a competitive element. Sometimes it's cooperative, but I do kind of see it as just kind of this other side of the coin for me in terms of storytelling. So how I got into it was once again kind of had this idea for a board game. Once again, kind of inspired by the Norse myths. I was playing another board game and thought like, oh man, it wasn't in fact similar at all to that board game, but I thought, I'm playing this board game and I've got this other idea that could turn into a game really easily. And I was surprised to find how vibrant the board game design community was in Edmonton, which is the city I was living at the time. And in fact, there was a prototyping convention coming up a few months after when I had this idea, and I thought, what the heck? Once again, it's sort of like the worst thing they can say is no, or the worst thing they can say is that right they don't enjoy the game. Like, okay, I'll find a way to get over that. So
And at
I
this
put
point,
together.
sorry to cut across you, Joshua, but at this
Yeah,
point, where were you in terms of writing your novels? Like, so was this all happening in tandem, or was it kind of you started the game and then went to the novel and then back to the game? Like,
no, that's kind of all happening in tandem. And by this point in time, I would have been like just finishing the novel, and really, I think kind of for myself creatively getting a sense of like, okay, I can finish things, I can see projects kind of through to the end. I was gaining a little bit of that sort of creative confidence, and so yeah, so right near the end of kind of finishing my first book, this is kind
okay.
of when I started this. And I got to give a lot of credit to that community of board game designers. There was about I think there was 40 designers that came to that first convention, and these are
Oh,
just, and Edmonton is not a big city in terms of North American cities. It's a pretty small one, but there were so many cool ideas, and some prototypes ranging from, just something that somebody sketched on a bunch of sticky notes to something that somebody actually paid, a company to print, and it looked really nice, and they hired an artist and stuff like that too. And so that was really inspiring to me. One of the things about writing books, and you maybe found the same thing too, is you realize at the end of the day is there's not like a secret computer program that all authors get. There's not like a secret, golden pen that they get so that they can write the story. Writing a story, you just write
You
it,
just do it.
and when you just do it. Yeah, and it's the same thing with board game design. People look at board games on the shelves, and board games today are incredible. It's a really kind of booming industry right now, and I personally love board games, but I know all over the world it's become a very popular thing, and the board games that are being produced there are just beautiful. They're works of art. One of the ones I played recently was Rising Sun, which is set in sort of feudal age Japan, and I think it actually won the award for game art of the year. But these are literally like masterpieces of art that are also sort of
One thing I
mechanical and also
think
sort of narrative.
that
Yeah.
a lot of people watching and listening, if they haven't thought of board games in this way, a lot of people are going to think we're talking about Monopoly and Game of Life and,
Oh my
and
gosh.
things
Yeah.
like this.
Oh.
And it's something, yeah, because it's something that I would have thought a number of years ago, and I recently had
Mm.
started. I started being the dungeon master for my friends in Dungeons and Dragons, and then that led me down the road of when I'd go to the game shop in Dublin City Centre, there's be all these things over there. I'm like, what are they? Oh, they're board games.
What's that?
Oh,
What's that? Yeah.
Monopoly's not on the shelf. And so it's something that board games are a lot more varied than we say the mainstream would be aware of. But they are growing. The variety that's within board games are growing in popularity. I mean, Settlers of Catan is huge, really. It's not beating Hasbro and all those guys yet, but it's definitely up there. So just
Yeah.
for the people listening, if they think we're talking about
Yeah, if you think we're talking about Clue, and yeah, none of
yeah,
those are bad games. There is a story. I'm not sure if this is true. There's a story that the designer of Monopoly actually designed it as like he was like a kind of very left wing person. He was actually designed it to show the evils of capitalism,
yeah,
right?
I've
So
heard
when people
that.
are like, why does this always end up like one person has all the money and
And
everybody's
it was a
fighting with
woman
each
that
other? It's like,
built and designed Monopoly as well, I believe.
possibly. I'm not sure exactly what the story was behind there, but fair to say, like you said, we're not talking about Monopoly here. We're talking about more modern games.
Yeah,
And I think Settlers of Catan is a great example of kind of one of the first games that came on the scene of that style, where there was this sort of like new narrative kind of mechanic, and different, just a different approach. I think a big part of it as well was crowdfunding platforms, which I'll thingy, the game I'm designing is on crowdfunding right now. And board games are unique in that the best board games that come out, like the top quality, top of the line ones, come out on crowdfunding. Those
yeah.
are, but without a doubt. And I don't know if there's any other. I don't know if there's any other industry that does that, in terms of like the best of the best in the industry coming out on crowdfunding. Now there's all sorts of cool things that come out in crowdfunding, but for board games, definitely, if you are like a serious designer, if you're a serious company, if you really want to kind of be at the top of the industry, you have to kind of be in the top of that crowdfunding. And there's this sort of culture of making the games that people want to play.
Yeah.
Not marketing executives sitting in. I know people complain about the publishing industry sometimes, in that a lot of the books, there's great books that get published, but a lot of the books, when they get published, are the decision isn't coming from unanimous consensus from kind of what people want. It's sort of people looking at, marketing folks kind of looking and saying what's going to sell, what's popular, kind of what's the zeitgeist right now. So that's a cool thing about board games, is that the games that are getting designed are backed by individual people who actually want to play these games. And the campaign I'm running is for about $10,000. We're just about there, and I'm fairly confident we're going to fund, which is going to be great. But I've got a designer friend from Edmonton, and she's a designer of several games. Really cool because she's a woman designer too, and there's not a ton of female designers. And her game Creature Comforts, I also encourage folks to check that one out. A really awesome game, just funded for over $200,000 Canadian. Like these are
Wow.
big projects, and they're expensive once you start looking at art. That can really add up. But it's its own. I've kind of learned about the industry, kind of working my way through prototypes, and then kind of running a game design group myself, and then sort of connecting with industry individuals. But it's its own sort of like world too, and it's been really fun to explore.
Yeah. And what it's because I'm trying to even wrap my head around it because like novels are so complex in the character arcs and you have the plot and then you have pacing and then you have to look at language and then like I don't know about you, but for me I always make an effort to make my novels as diverse as I can without having to rewrite absolutely everything.
Yes,
So
yes.
the novels are so complex. What is it about games then? What's the big difference do you find between writing and creating and designing a game like all thingy compared to writing a novel?
Great question. I view them as fundamentally the same process, just like you said, through different mediums. In a novel, you are more kind of in the conductor's seat in terms of you're kind of guiding people through the story. I think of like a railroad, right? In that you're sort of just like showing them the scenery or showing them the characters, but they're not able to sort of like jump off the train and run into the woods and go look at like what's over here, right? They're just you're kind of in charge of that narrative experience. You still have to understand um, and try to think about how people are going to react to kind of what they're seeing to what you're writing. And I think that's a mark of somebody who's got a little bit more experience in terms of writing books is being able to write something and have a bit more of a critical eye in terms of, this is what I'm trying to say, but oh, I could see how this could easily be misconstrued to this. And some of that's just going to be your beta readers, right? Throwing that out to people and seeing what their reactions are. But you sort of have to manage a lot of that in your head without getting a lot of feedback until the narrative is pieced together enough that somebody can actually read it and make sense of what you're trying to say. With board games, that process of getting feedback from people and getting them involved in the process, it comes a lot earlier. So I mean, you might prototype a game in like an afternoon. Like you might put something together. If you, I like to use Photoshop to make it a little bit fancier. So for me, it might take like a few weeks, but then you put it on the table. And inevitably, no matter how airtight you think your mechanic is and your theme, somebody's going to find a way to break it the first time you throw it on the table, and you're
Yeah.
just going to keep throwing it on the table, and people are just going to keep breaking it. They're going to find loopholes. People are sneaky, people are smart, right? So they find ways to do these sort of things. And yeah, there's a lot more time spent, we just say like at the table, with playtesters sort of playing it, giving suggestions. You go back, iterating it a bit, kind of putting it back on the table and finding ways to work out the bugs. That could be, a loophole in the strategy, right? There's a way to win that one player can kind of take advantage of. It also could just be like the start of this game is boring. The end of it is exciting because you've got your resources and stuff all together. But at the beginning, I'm bored, and you have to fix that. How can you get players engaged sort of like right away? Um, eh, I'm going to say it takes me less time to design a game than it does to design to write a novel. But it is a lot of work with other folks where I can kind of just sit down and plug away at a novel. Like I did my first one for however long I want in my room, sort of typing it out, making progress. With a game, I can't really make progress until I find people that kind of come and play it, so that I can go back and iterate. So there are challenges to both sides, but once again, for me, creatively, I think it's been a really nice balance of writing the books has been a little more of an individual sort of project, and the designing games, not only my own games, but also helping other folks in the community that I host here. We're not meeting once again because of COVID, but when we did, just sort of like bringing in newer players and game designers, and kind of facilitating the game design process for those folks too has been really fun. So
Very good, very good. I'm conscious that we're coming up to the end of our time, and it's really annoying. The more I do this show, the more I don't know how to explain it. It's like the better I get at wanting to know more.
right, and then yeah, it gets longer, and then yeah,
Yeah, and then I'm like,
yeah,
we've been talking for 4 hours.
yeah, yeah.
So I would like to know, what do you think is easier to write, a game or a book, and then what is more creatively satisfying?
Oh, Connor, you're killing me, man. You're killing me.
Good.
Okay. All right. All right. So, what is easier? I'm not gonna say easier in terms of like energy or in terms of, and there's this sort of like pride factor. I think if you're gonna design a game, you really you got to be like up for like being like Rocky, right? In the first room, you're gonna get beat on, right? So
Yeah.
it doesn't matter like how good your game is, how nice the art is, how slick the mechanic is. It's gonna get trashed every time. This game that you poured your heart and soul into when you put it on the table, it's gonna get trashed, and not because people are mean or anything like that, but because that's just the process of game design is that if you want it to be better, you need to iterate. So in terms of time period, I would say shorter to design a game. I think I'm working on a game with a friend of mine right now who has a series of Viking books called the Viking verse, and so we're going to design a game for it. And that process is probably going to take about 6 to 8 months to do that. Whereas for the novel, I typically take about a year to write it, and then I try to give myself a few months to edit it. Partly because I'm not working full time with writing, I'm sort of carving that out of my daily schedule.
Yeah.
But yeah, time wise, I would say games take less time. It's hard to say like. I think the feedback on a game though is a little bit more instantly rewarding. At least when somebody reads your book, you'll often kind of get a message from them, but you're not going to like sit there very creepily and just watch them, like read the book and sort of like clap every time they laugh and sort of do a little fist pump every time they kind of get a little cheered up, right? That it's not that sort of like play by play sort of thing. Whereas when you're playing a game, you see that you kind of create this world and set people on this adventure, and then you can see them sort of like having fun, and they figured out a strategy that worked, and they took a risk and then it paid off, and you kind of see that and that's super exciting as a game designer, is to see people having fun and really engaging with this sort of game, even if it's a shorter experience. Reading a book might take a week or a few weeks, whereas playing a game might only take 30 to 40 minutes. But you get to kind of be there. It's a little bit more like you're in the world with the people experiencing it at the same time.
Yeah, so very different.
Very different. Yeah, I don't think I really answered your question. I just said different,
No,
but
but that's
but
it.
there you go.
I,
So
to be honest, I didn't think you would. I
yeah,
didn't think you'd say, like, this is easier, but this is more fun.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
yeah, no, I think because it is very interesting, and that's what I wanted to get.
cool,
So when
cool.
asked, I've very quick questions at the end that I always ask everybody. So when we're finished this interview and we've said our goodbyes and good lucks and all that, what's the first thing you're gonna do?
Oh my goodness. Well, I'll probably make myself another coffee. That's because it's the weekend and I do that sort of thing. And I got a call with my good friend Muhammad Ahmed, who is a writer from the States, and we've been invited to actually, by the publisher, create an anthology of historical fiction based off the board game, which is really cool because the
Oh
publisher
wow,
Outland Entertainment does the sort of a broad range of things from comic books to games to all sorts of things. So his background is in Islamic science fiction. Yes, you heard me correctly, Islamic science fiction, and he curated another anthology called The Mosque Among the Stars, which is super cool.
very cool.
If you want to check it out, but I'm on a phone call with him. We've been a little delayed in the process. We're getting all the submissions, and we're looking at the historical fiction that explores interactions between Vikings and the powerful Islamic kingdoms that existed at the same time, which raises a lot of eyebrows for people. They're thinking like Vikings, like Muslims, like what, does that really happen? But you think about it historically, and yes, it did happen. Is
Yeah,
the short answer. But historically, I mean, Europe was kind of they call it the Dark Ages, mainland Europe, and that's the narrative we kind of get taught in school. But the golden age of the Vikings, in terms of their exploration and their creating new settlements and sailing farther west, east, north, south than a lot of people in Europe had even imagined possible,
mm,
happened at the same time that the Islamic kingdoms were rising in the Mediterranean. And so you've got the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, and you've got Al-Andalus and stuff like that. So that's been really cool. We're going to chat. And once again, we're a little bit behind on schedule. COVID stuff over here is really screwed with everybody's schedules. And then I was the silly Canadian that thought we would get anything done in the week of the American election. I put like a due date for one of the draft submissions there, and that was a bad idea. Silly
yeah,
Canadian. Yeah, yeah. So, anyways, that was I'll take the fall for that one because that was my
that's
fault.
fair.
Anyways, we're chatting about that. So I'll be making some coffee and then chatting with Muhammad. So yeah.
Good, good, good. And then I'll just ask two more questions and I'll let you go then. Do you have any goals that aren't to do with writing or storytelling? Like, is there anything you'd really like to achieve in the near or distant future?
Yeah, I've got a mentor, like a writer mentor from Vancouver, who's a good friend, a little older than me, but I had a really good chat with him the other day, and he was kind of saying, when you're doing this like writing thing, you kind of have to consider. His way of breaking it up was this: basically, if you're a writer self, you've got your author self, you've got your business self, and you've got your personal self, and
Mm,
you need to find a way to kind of make all four of those things work together. And if you don't, you're going to be kind of miserable, right? You can be a successful writer. You can be writing lots and lots and lots of books, but you're not taking care of the business side, then you're not like selling them. You need to figure that out. You could be a really successful author. You could have a huge following on Twitter and Instagram and have this big sort of personality that's out in the public, but your personal life might be sort of falling apart because you're not paying attention to your family or your friends or things like that. And so that's one of the things he had said to me was like, not that I'm like in a bad state. I feel like I'm in a pretty good state right now, but he said, as you kind of move down the road, consider that sort of thing. Don't kind of get yourself stuck in this rut where, one part of your life, one of those four aspects is doing really well while the other ones are suffering. Find a way to balance it out. So yeah, my wife and I just bought a house in where we live here, so that's a big deal. I don't know what it's like in Ireland. Houses are ridiculously expensive in Canada, particularly.
yep.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Same thing, right? So this is no small feat. This is like we were kind of wondering at some point in time if we'd ever be able to afford a house. So I think personally for us, over the next few months, we're gonna kind of reno it. It's a smaller place, but that's just kind of what we're looking for. We're kind of going to make it the house we want to be. We've moved around a lot the last few years, and we're kind of looking forward to just sort of settling in and kind of growing some roots in the community. So I'd say if I had some short-term goals, renovating the house the next 6 months, that's gonna be a nice break from all the other kind of craziness, busyness, work stuff. Just sort of
Yeah.
a bit of a personal project. So yeah.
Brilliant, brilliant. I'm gonna have all links to everything we've mentioned and everything like that in the description on the YouTube video and in the show notes if you're listening to the podcast version of this. So your website is Joshua Gillingham, which is there as well. But the last question I'd like to ask you is, what was the last book you read?
Oh, I knew you were going to ask this question. I wanted to make sure I credit the author because this book has been really good. So my wife is a serial library user. When she goes to the library,
I
she
was
literally
really
brings
waiting for you to finish that sentence because it's like,
yeah, yeah,
what?
serial,
Serial
is it
what?
killer or what? Yeah, what was it? Yeah, no, she's a serial library user. When she goes to the library, she brings like a tote, almost like bin
Oh wow.
bag that she can like haul back, and she reads them all. She reads so fast, but she gives me great book recommendations. And the most recent one that we've both just been digging our teeth into is this book called Breath by James Nestor, which is not a work of fiction. I'm usually kind of reading fantasy fiction, that sort of thing. But he was researching free divers, who are folks who dive underwater for a variety of reasons and train themselves to hold their breath for like up to like 9 to 12 minutes, which is like doesn't even seem possible. So he was
Wow.
researching them, and as part of that research, he kind of started talking to scientists and researchers and medical professionals and also sort of like spiritual teachers about like the importance of breath and how to use breath. And it's going to sound a little sort of like hippie. You got to forgive me. I'm on the West Coast here, and we're kind of known for being hippies out here. But anyway, it's a great book. It'll change your life, and you will breathe differently, and you will feel so much better. So anyways, it's called Breath. It's by James Nestor, and I highly recommend that people check it out.
Brilliant. Joshua, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been really interesting to get to know you and to learn so much about game design and novel writing and how they help each other and yet are nothing similar at all.
Conor, thanks so much for having me on. It's been such a pleasure, and yeah, I really enjoyed chatting with you today.
Brilliant. Thank you.